Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 13 of my Whispers of the Old Gods card review. I've got 3 new cards to take a look at today, and in fact I think all 3 of them are pretty interesting. So let's go ahead and jump right in with the card you see, which is the 5 mana rogue minion Shadowcaster. This is a 4/4 minion with a pretty interesting battle cry. Choose a friendly minion, so someone that's already on the board, and add a 1/1 copy of that minion to your hand, and it only costs 1. So let's break this down piece by piece. Starting off, you're getting a 4/4 for 5 mana, which is not an ideal stat allocation, obviously. You'd really prefer something like a 5/5 at least, or a 5/6 if you're just talking about raw, kind of vanilla stats expected for 5 mana. But that said, Rogue as a class in general is pretty willing to run understated minions that have really powerful effects. So Azure Drakes, for instance, are very comparable to Shadowcaster as a 5 mana 4/4 with an effect that really makes an impact. There's also cards like Gadget Day and Auctioneer, of course, which is a 4/4 for 6 mana. Neither of those have slowed down Rogue because of their body size, and Rogue typically doesn't run a lot of minions bigger than 4/4 anyway. So I don't think that the poor stats are really going to be what holds Shadowcaster back. And in fact, I don't think it's going to be held back at all, because I think this is a pretty interesting battle cry for a different kind of rogue deck. I'm not sure this fits into the traditional, miracle oil style rogue that's about drawing through your deck really quickly and then dumping out tons of burst damage. I think this card fits more into a board presence style rogue, kind of like the Unearthed Raptor style rogue, where you get some minions out early, copy their effects, and are able to generate a really strong and powerful board presence and a lot of value really quickly out of those cards. So, for instance, this Battlecry copying a minion, if you get something like, let's just use Piloted Shredder as an example, even though it's leaving standard format, copying a 1/1 Piloted Shredder is actually really strong, particularly for 1 mana. Because that means you're getting a 1/1 with a Death Rattle that spawns a 2-cost minion, which means in total you're getting, basically 3 mana in value out of that second minion you play, and it only costs 1 mana, so it's a 2 mana advantage. You're getting a lot of stats really for 5 mana at that point, even though it costs a total of 6 mana. So you can kind of think about this card as like a 6-drop and try to figure out how much value you can get out of a 6-drop to compare it more accurately. And even with the Piloted Shredder example, it's always going to give you 5/5 in total stats for 6 mana, but often even more than that, depending on the effects that you copy. So you can copy a Ragnaros, right, and play a 1 mana Ragnaros that only has 1/1 in stats, but still shoots an 8 damage missile every turn, which would be absolutely amazing. And there's a lot of different ways to pull off some shenanigans with this card. For instance, with Brand Bronzebeard, where you could copy 2 instances of Ragnaros, you could then have 3 Ragnaroses on your board, essentially, each firing 8 damage apiece. So, obviously, there are countless cards that synergize well with this one in Rogue and in neutral sets as well. So, I actually think this is a pretty powerful card, as long as there's a deck that's designed to utilize it, and a couple of other Rogue cards that kind of fit this synergy. I also think this even has some mill Rogue potential, because copying something like a Cold Light Oracle or Anti-Killbot and all that stuff gives you cheaper ways to do the things you really like to do in mill Rogue too. So, a really strong card and a pretty interesting design and a great fit for Rogue in my mind. Moving on to the next card. This one is a Mage minion, coming in at 4 mana, and it is the Demented Frostcaller. It's a 2/4 in stats, and after you cast a spell, you freeze a random enemy. So, Demented Frostcaller is really basically a Flame Waker, the 3 mana Blackrock Mountain Flame Waker, but at a little extra cost. It's 4 mana instead, but the same stat allocation of 2/4. And the effect operates the exact same way with a different outcome. Instead of shooting off 2 missiles every time you cast a spell, this one freezes a random enemy instead. So, reading the initial reactions to this card, a lot of people are saying, for a 4-drop, the stats are very weak, which is undebatably accurate. 2 attack is very bad for 4-drop, because by then it will trade into almost nothing. And 4 health is also pretty bad for a 4-drop in most cases because it dies to so many different things, including a number of 3-drops. So definitely not a trading body type 4-drop. And also the effect is a little bit slow, right? It's freezing random enemies, which means if you freeze a minion, they stick on the board. If you freeze the enemy face, you maybe have not accomplished much at all. So a lot of people are thinking it won't make a significant enough impact. Unlike Flame Waker, which tends to just outright kill stuff or kill your opponent, this one has to operate a little more slowly. But I kind of think this card might eventually be good. I agree with all those sentiments that I just shared, but in the right kind of matchup, this card could essentially lock down your opponent forever. It could essentially just continue to freeze their board over and over again and just keep attacking. And with cards like Ice Lance, that also sometimes sets up extra damage as well when things are frozen. So against like weapon classes that really love boards, for instance, a Patron Warrior style deck, this could lock down a Patron Warrior forever. You could basically just continue to freeze patrons, freeze the enemy's face so they never get that death spite off. The problem is that it's only freezing one random enemy at a time, so once they have 3 or 4 minions, it's really going to be hard to cast that many spells in a single turn. So, we'll see. This card has a very powerful effect in my mind, because it can just totally shut out an opponent and force them to use spells only, which some classes just don't have removal spells that do 4 damage, like Warrior, for instance, have a very tough time dealing with this if their face is frozen and their minions are frozen. So perhaps it's almost more of like a tech card to answer certain meta decks. I could also see this being decent in Zoo in some ways. But it's probably still just too slow and too low of an instant impact to really matter. So I think it probably is a worse Flame Waker, but in a Tempo Mage deck or maybe even Freeze style deck, who knows? Demented Frostcaller certainly seems to have a chance to me. So let's move on to the final card for this video. It's another 4-mana minion. This time, though, it's Priest, and it is the Shifting Shade. It's 4 mana, 4/3 in stats, so it's the first half of a Piloted Shredder, but it also has a Death Rattle, but of course, this is not like Piloted Shredder's Death Rattle at all. With this one, you copy a card from your opponent's deck, and you add it to your hand. So Shifting Shade is basically a minion with half of a Thought Steal attached, right? Because that Death Rattle effect is exactly what Thought Steal does, except it only does it once, and it's a little bit delayed because it happens as a result of the Death Rattle. So, I mean, 97% of the time, this Death Rattle effect will go off. People will not waste a silence on Shifting Shade, so I'm going to take it for granted that you're almost always going to copy the card when you play Shifting Shade. And if you think about Thought Steal, that's a 3-mana card, so this is half as potent as Thought Steal for the Death Rattle alone, which means it's about 1.5 mana of value, which would reduce the mana cost of this card theoretically to about 2.5 mana. So when you consider the stats as a 4/3 for 2.5 mana, that's actually pretty solid. That's, a lot of 3-mana cards are 4/3s that have decent effects, so that doesn't actually feel too bad to me. I think a lot of people are saying that the body on this is too weak for a 4-drop, but if you think about a lot of the times as a priest, you might just be casting Thought Steal on turn 4 anyway. Then why not play a Shifting Shade? You still get the extra resource from the Thought Steal effect, but you also keep yourself alive on the board just a little bit longer or apply just a little bit more pressure, sometimes trading up into bigger stuff with 4 health. So I can see some merits to this card. It's a little basically of a non-committal Thought Steal. It's one that doesn't waste an entire turn of board presence just to accrue resources. It's a halfway point between Thought Steal and a solid 4-drop minion. So that said, cards that are kind of a jack of all trades don't necessarily always work well because they just don't fit into a deck archetype in a very specific way, so they may not make room in a list. But I don't think this card's bad at all, particularly in control style matchups, just because you could run this with 2 Thought Steals and then make your deck 36 cards long instead of, well, not exactly 36, but a few extra cards deep instead of only running 30 cards, which is fantastic in fatigue matchups. particularly against other control decks, which tend to run really high-value cards, so you're more likely to steal something very good from their deck as well. So Shifting Shade to me actually looks like a decent option in some pre-stacks. It's just going to have to fight for room, and depending on what falls out of the meta from Standard versus Wild format and what doesn't, I could see this carving out a spot in certain control-style priest lists. I like Shifting Shade more than most people. So that said, I think all three of these cards have some potential to see play. I think Shadowcaster is actually a very strong card, potentially, that will set up some crazy combos and make board presence rogues a more viable threat, particularly in the mid game. So I can't wait to see these cards in actions and see how they actually shake out in the meta, because I think there is a lot of potential here. If you have any questions or comments on these cards, or you think I got it all wrong, let me know in the comments. I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, game on.